Good morning. Looks like summer. We've got two classes in here and it's still a little bit small today. All right, so in this class we're in 2 Samuel. We're on a quarter that is about David and Solomon. And so we're in 2 Samuel chapter 18 today, but we'll do a little bit of catch up before we get started in chapter 18. So 2 weeks ago, we talked about two of David's sons who were first and second in line for the throne. First was Amnon, and he was first in line for the throne, David's first son. Second was Absalom, and he was second in line. Even though he was David's third son, he was still second in line. All three of the first sons had different mothers. Many of his sons had different mothers. Until the end, Bathsheba had more than one. But we saw a couple weeks ago where Amnon was infatuated with Absalom's sister, Tamar. And Amnon liked her so much, she was so pretty, that he ended up raping her. And we read a couple weeks ago about Absalom getting revenge 2 years later after this happened at a sheep shearing festival. And then when that happened, David's other sons were also there at the festival with him. And so all the sons kind of fled and left the scene. They all ended up back in Jerusalem with the exception of Absalom, and he stayed behind. Do you remember where he stayed behind? Where did he stay behind at? In Geshur. Does anybody know why he stayed in Geshur? We talked about it a couple weeks ago. That's where his grandfather was the king. So his grandfather was king in Geshur, and so he felt probably that he was safe if he stayed there in Geshur, in his mom's hometown. He thought that he'd be kept safe, and he stayed there for about 3 years. Last week, we looked at Absalom's return to Jerusalem. Joab knows that David misses Absalom, and so Joab makes a plan essentially to bring Absalom home. It's not David's idea, it's Joab's idea. And so David ends up agreeing to it, and Joab goes and he gets Absalom, brings him back to Jerusalem. But David does not want to see Absalom when he gets there. Even though it's been 3 years since Absalom killed his brother, David still doesn't want to see his face. And so when he comes home, he's able to return to Jerusalem, but Absalom has to go stay in his own place. He's not able to see his father. At this point, Absalom appears to still be pretty loyal to his father. He's prepared for David to put him to death for what he had done to his brother, because after he'd been home for a while, I think it's 3 years, Absalom tells Joab he wants to see his father. He wants to see his face. Even if that means that his dad puts him to death, he wants to see him. So at this point, he's probably still faithful to David, at least somewhat. We do read, though, of David's love and his compassion for his children, so it is possible that he knows David's not going to kill him, even if he comes back. Especially since it had been 5 years since this had happened. If David wanted him dead, he probably could have made that happen anytime in the last 5 years. Last week, we also read a little bit about Absalom and his good looks. We also have the Bible tells us about his sister was so pretty that his brother, her half-brother, had an affair with her, lusted over her. And then the Bible tells us about Absalom's daughter, who's also named after his sister, Tamar. The Bible tells us of Tamar's beauty. So with David being king of Israel, he pretty much could have any woman that he wants. And so he probably had some of the prettiest women. And the Bible tells us with this lineage, with Michal, I believe is her name, they were exceptionally good looking. Why is that important? Why does the Bible tell us that? Who knows? But it does give us some context when we look at last week's lesson, when Absalom started to win over the hearts of the Israelites. So Absalom would sit at the city gates, and when people would come with a matter to be resolved, they came and they were angry with somebody else, and so Absalom would be there. He would intercept them. He would tell them that, yes, whatever your issue is, it is a big deal. I'm sorry David hasn't appointed me as a judge, but everyone that comes through the gate, essentially it says he greets them and he kisses them. And he makes friends with them, basically. And so here we have his good looks probably helping that as well. That as they come through the gates, they see the king's son. The king's son's very good looking, and he consoles them. He tries to help them out. So Absalom starts to win over the hearts of the Israelites. So the end of last week's scripture that we looked at was the beginning of Absalom and his plot to take over Israel. And this is interesting to me, some of the cultural differences between now and 3,000 years ago. It's hard for me to grasp. So at this point, David was the king of Israel. Who was next in line for king of Israel? Amnon had been killed. The second brother wasn't really considered to be in line. So Absalom was the one who was in line to be king. He was the one that was going to have it. And so he had, at this point, he got to come home. He had all the perks of being royalty. He got to live a life of luxury. He had men assigned to him, servants. He was rich as could be. But still, for whatever reason, he decides that he wants the power of becoming king. And even where they're at right now, Israel seems to be happy with David and his ruling. David has been such a good warrior in the past that nobody's really coming to battle David. And so there's not really any challenge to the throne for Absalom. So if he just waits it out, he'll have a good life as king. Larry?
I thought that whenever David and Bathsheba, that David promised Bathsheba that Solomon would be king. I didn't realize that he had said that Absalom would be king.
He didn't say, it was just in line, order of sons. And so, yes, Solomon would end up being his successor. But as far as just order of sons, Absalom would have been next in line to have the right to the throne.
Why did she go to him then? I thought it said in there that she went to him. I'll look it up.
Okay. So, as time passes by, Absalom evidently grows power hungry and very impatient. So he cooks up a scheme after some amount of time. We don't know how much time it is, years probably. After some point in time, he has essentially most of Israel on his side. And so Israel loves Absalom. And at this point that we're getting to in our lesson today, they're willing to serve Absalom over David. But David still has plenty of loyal followers, both close to him and then kind of out in Israel as well. I didn't hear you, I'm sorry. Right.
Where are you at right now?
In between chapter 15 and 18, just kind of summarizing.
Okay, this is First Kings 1 and 17, and it said, Bathsheba fell low down before the king. What is it you want, king? She said to him, my lord, you swore to me, your servant, my lord your God, Solomon your son, shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne.
Yep. So at that point, we know that God has told David that the son born to Bathsheba would become king. So you're right in that. That's correct. But it's just in how that worked back then, in order of sons, Solomon was several down the line. Yeah, there were several in front of him that had the right to the throne before Solomon. I think it was God that made the promise, right? I don't know that it was David. I think it was God that made the promise. And so God had to work through all of the things that happened to all of the sons before Solomon came to the point where he was the one in line to serve as king. So most of Israel at this point has kind of fallen in love with Absalom. They're willing to serve him over David, but David still has people that follow him as well. So David is informed by some of the people that still follow him of this plan that Absalom has to come kill him. And so David ends up fleeing Jerusalem, but he leaves behind 10 of his concubines to care for the palace. And so they stay behind. And then one of his advisors comes to him, Hushai, and wants to stay with David. And David tells him, probably not a good idea. If you stay with me, you're going to be a burden. I assume he meant, if you stay with me, you're close to me, so you're somebody that I'm personally going to have to look over. And he's at the point of where he's trying to flee and get out of Jerusalem and keep him and his circle safe. And so all he needs is, or what he doesn't need is one more person that he has to look after and keep safe. So he says, instead, you would do a lot more service to me if you would essentially go be a spy. Go into Absalom's camp, pledge your allegiance to Absalom, and then you can send word to me of whatever his plans are that's going on. So Hushai does that. He agrees, and he goes and he gains Absalom's trust. He appears to be there when Absalom's top advisor at the time comes up with this plan, which is he tells Absalom, your dad left behind these 10 concubines at the palace. If you want to assert your power as king, if you want to assert your dominance over your father, you can go to the palace, take the concubines, take them on the roof and sleep with them in view of all of Israel, and that will show Israel that you are more powerful than your father. And so I think, from what I could tell, Hushai seems to be there at that time. He goes along with that plan, lets it happen, because he wants to earn the trust of Absalom. And then, after that happens, at some point, Hushai goes against his top advisor's advice when his advisor says, okay, it's time. Y'all need to go forward, march, kill David, kill his men. And Absalom sends for Hushai and tells him what his top advisor had said. And Hushai says, no, it's not a good idea. You know that your dad is a very fierce warrior. You know that he's probably not sitting there with his men. He's probably hiding in a cave, and he's ready to pounce for anybody that attacks. So what I would advise you to do is go get more people. Go get more people from Israel. Find more Israelites to come so that you have the numbers when you go in to attack David. And so Absalom thinks that's a good idea, and so that's what he does. It buys David a little bit of time. And so Hushai sends word to David, and David takes all of his men and he crosses the Jordan. And that kind of puts us up to where we are today in chapter 18. David and his men have just crossed over the Jordan. They know that the Israelites are coming to attack them at this point, and so they're getting into battle mode. So we'll start in 2 Samuel chapter 18, verses 1 through 4. Then David numbered the people who were with him, and set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. David sent the people out, 1/3 under the command of Joab, 1/3 under the command of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the command of Ittai the Gittite. And the king said to the people, I myself will surely go out with you. But the people said, you should not go out, for if we indeed flee, they will not care about us. Even if half of us die, they will not care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore now it is better that you be ready to help us from the city. Then the king said to them, whatever seems best to you, I will do. So the king stood beside the gate, and all the people went out by hundreds and thousands. And so, as I said, they just crossed over the Jordan. David is in battle mode. As he's crossing over the Jordan, he knows what's about to happen. He's probably strategizing along the way. But he's about to be pursued by who? Absalom and who? Israelites. Not Absalom and the army, because who's got the army? David's got the army. So David's got the army, but Absalom has the numbers. But David has these trained men. And David himself, he's led a battle or two or a couple hundred. So he knows what he's doing. He's got the strategy before he even gets across the Jordan. So as soon as he gets there, we read in the beginning of chapter 18, he starts implementing that strategy. So he takes account of his men. He takes a census. He knows who he's got. He knows what skills he's got. And then he starts to separate them into groups. Separates them into 3 main groups. And I'm sure with his experience, every group had their own assignment that they were to go do. But he breaks it up even further into that. And it tells us that he breaks up men in sections of hundreds as well. And so he's appointing not just the 3 that we saw there. He's appointed, no telling, dozens probably of commanders over the smaller pieces of his army. So he's broken his army up. He's laid his strategy out. He's ready for this battle that's about to take place. Even before that, we see in the chapter before this, as soon as David gets across the Jordan River, there are some allies there because they're in the wilderness, and so there's not many resources. But he has allies that like him, that he's gained the respect of over his years as king, and they bring supplies and food to help David and his men as they're in the wilderness. And so that's an advantage that they will have once the Israelites come after them that the Israelites will not have in the wilderness. So at that time, David was commander-in-chief. And at this point in history, the commander-in-chief was the one who leads the battle. They're out in front. They lead their men into battle. But at this point, his men tell him, it's probably not a good idea for you to do that. They weren't having it. And they gave him some reasons why, because they knew that he would want some reasons why. Otherwise, he would just go anyway. So the first one, they said that he's worth 10,000 of them. What does that mean when he said that you're worth 10,000 of us? Yeah. On the surface, it seems like he's very valuable, and that's very true. He is valuable. But they go on to explain it a little bit, that he's worth 10,000 of them. If David's killed in battle, who becomes king? Absalom. If Absalom becomes king, what happens to David's followers? They're what? They'd be under Absalom. What happens very often when somebody takes over? They kill them, right, from the top down. And so that's part of it. Is he's not just valuable because he's king. He's valuable because a lot of their lives depend on his life. And so if he's killed in battle, a lot of them will also be killed after the battle or in battle as well. Then they tell him, you're more help to us in the city. What could that mean, that he's more help to them in the city? And leader, right? And so he got across the Jordan River. He had his plan laid out. And so that's what they're saying is, you're more valuable as a strategist. So you go be in the city, and if we need help, we'll send word, and you can figure out what the strategy needs to be, and you can send whatever help that we need. So you're in charge of the war, but you don't need to be out there on the battle lines. Right. Kind of the last ditch. Yep. The third reason that's really not mentioned here that they probably don't want to talk to David about, but what could be a third reason that they wouldn't want David to go into battle? And we're about to read about it, if you've read ahead. He would not take Absalom's life. That's right. And his men, we've seen before, Joab, in chapters before, has kind of done what David needed to do but wouldn't do. And so that's where they're at this point, is they know that for this to end well for David, Absalom has to lose his life, and that his father will not do that. And so that's kind of the third reason that they don't really say to him. But if David's not with the troops, they can go after Absalom and they can kill him. So David was a good leader. He wasn't a dictator. So they gave him all these reasons. They laid it out, and he listened to them, and he agreed that it probably wasn't the best for him to go out into battle. And so he stays by as they go out. But as a good leader, he sits at the gate, wherever they're at the gate, and he watches all of his men go by. Cheering them all, who knows? But he watches them all go by as they go out to battle, just so they know that he's there with them and he's not deserting them. All right, in verse 5, it says, the king charged Joab and Abishai, saying, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king charged all the commanders concerning Absalom. So David knew what was going to happen to Absalom when they found him. He absolutely knew, based on the time and the culture that they were in, what had to happen. And he knew what his men were going to do. And so this is him telling his men, deal gently with him. I don't want you to kill him. But he does it where everybody can hear. And there's a reason for that. And we'll get to that in just a minute. But he wants to make sure that they know that he wants them to bring Absalom back alive. And he wants everybody that's under his main captains to feel pressure to bring Absalom back alive. All right, verses 6 through 8. Then the people went out into the field against Israel, and the battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. The people of Israel were defeated there before the servants of David, and the slaughter there that day was great, 20,000 men. For the battle was spread over the whole countryside, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. So at this point, it's very clear David is no longer in charge of Israel. We read kind of as Absalom gains the heart and the trust of them, but it's at this point in the Bible that it says that David and his servants go to fight against Israel. So David is no longer in charge of Israel at this moment. Absalom is in charge. But the people who stayed loyal to David fought against Israel because they were not loyal to him. Based on the previous chapter, we can assume that Absalom had many more people in this battle than David did, because of the advice of David's advisor when he tried to buy David some time. And he said, no, go get more men. Make sure you have plenty of people if you want to destroy your father's army, because they are a good army. But David, we know, was an experienced military leader, and so he didn't need more men. He just needed the experience, and he used all the resources that were available to him. He got over, he was ahead of them, so he knew the area, the wilderness they were in. He had supplies for his men, and he had a strategy laid out, whereas they were just coming to find him. They were chasing him, looking for David to kill him however they could. There wasn't really much strategy on Absalom's part that we read about.
When he talked about David, the book breaks it out is how David, as any good leader does, he listened to his people. And when he said aloud, he had confidence in them that they were going to carry out the purpose.
Right.
That's an important part of the leader as well.
Right. He trusted his men, and they trusted him. Yeah. So it tells us the battle took place in the woods of Ephraim. And at this point, we can see that God's still on David's side, because it says more people died by, what does it say? I lost it. The forest. Yeah, the forest devoured more people that day than the sword. And so that's talking more about the Israelites that are looking for David than it is David's men. So God was still with David at this point in time. In verse 9, it says, Now Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. For Absalom was riding on his mule, and his mule went under a thick branch of a great oak. And his head caught fast in the oak, and he was left hanging between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him kept going. So right here we see Absalom himself was not the experienced commander that his father was, for multiple reasons. First of all, he's riding a mule. If you're going into battle, a mule's probably not the animal that you want to be riding if you need to move quickly. So he's riding a mule. We also read in previous chapters about Absalom's hair, and how his hair was so thick and beautiful and heavy, and it was kind of a point of pride for him. But that point of pride for him ends up becoming his death sentence here, because other translations, this one says it was his head that got caught. Other translations say that it was his hair that got caught in the oak tree. So if you can imagine, it's the wilderness, it's the woods that they're in, and he's riding a mule through the woods. You know, he's probably ducking through, and at some point, his hair, his big, heavy head of hair, gets stuck. We've got a couple comments. We'll start over here. I saw Donna first. Right. Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Chris? That's a great point. Yeah. So if you're not doing God's will, you're not going to succeed. Right. Yep. So David was still the appointed king of Israel. And David's still the one that God had chosen. God had not said that Absalom was going to be king. As we talked about earlier, God actually told us which son would succeed him. And so Absalom is kind of trying to assume the kingship before David passes. And as he pointed out, God makes sure that Absalom knows that that's not what his plan is, because it isn't anybody else that finds him and takes him out. It's God that has him stuck essentially in a tree. Somebody else had a comment.
Actually, whether Solomon was told or not, it's probably after this. The reference in First Kings is at the end of David's life. He says it was promised. Nobody knows exactly when. Probably after this, but when Solomon was born, God told David then that he loved him and named him Jedediah, I think was his love of God. And so God had a plan all through this, as we talked some last week about taking out the heirs. He knew Solomon was going to be the one. And so he had a systematic plan that took out Hammon, takes out Absalom, skips the second one we've already talked about. The next one's going to be Abijah or whatever his name is. And God had already, by that time, said, yeah, you're next in line, but you're not going to be. And so he knew he wanted Absalom, on the other hand, was kind of in the line right there. And God was going to say, yeah, no matter what you do, no matter how much David loves you, no matter how much power of the people you get, God's still in control. He just took him by his vanity, his fancy hair, and hung him.
Yep.
He took him out, basically, there. And God systematically took them all out, using man to accomplish his will.
Right. Yep. Let's go on to verse 10. So when a certain man saw it, we don't get the name of the man, he told Joab and said, behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak. And so this is the verse that I just kind of have to stop and think, how did that conversation go? He tells Joab, I see Absalom hanging in an oak. And Joab's like, what do you mean hanging in an oak? I mean, envision that conversation. First of all, Absalom is the king, or trying to make himself the king. So why would he be by himself? That was another mistake we didn't talk about earlier that he made. He's out on a mule, but he's also by himself. He doesn't have his people surrounding him to protect him. So as soon as his mule walks out from under him, he's a sitting duck. He's got nowhere to go. He's defenseless. But I think it's probably a funny conversation that they had, as he's trying to explain to Joab, yeah, he's just hanging there in the tree by his hair. He can't move. No, nobody's with him. No, he doesn't have a mule. How'd he get there? I don't know how he got there, but he's hanging by his hair. So I thought it was a funny verse. We'll go on to verses 11 through 15. Then Joab said to the man who had told him, now behold, you saw him. Why did you not strike him there to the ground? And I would have given you 10 pieces of silver and a belt. The man said to Joab, even if I should receive 1,000 pieces of silver in my hand, I would not put out my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king charged you and Abishai and Ittai, saying, protect for me the young man Absalom. Otherwise, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there is nothing hidden from the king, then you would have stood aloof. Then you yourself would have stood aloof. But Joab said, I will not waste my time here with you. And so he took 3 spears in his hand, and he thrust them through the heart of Absalom while he was yet alive in the midst of the oak. And 10 young men who carried Joab's armor gathered around and struck Absalom and killed him. So this is probably exactly how David expected it to play out. David probably knew that one of his top 3 generals or commanders would not be the person that found Absalom, and that it would be one of the people that were kind of lower in rank and file. And so when David tells them before they go out, he makes sure that it is where everybody can hear it, because he wants the people that are going to find him not to kill him right away. And then it happens probably just as David thought. They go back, they tell their commander, and their commander's like, why didn't you kill him? And he said, well, did you not hear what David said? David told us not to kill him. And so he argues with him. But finally, Joab essentially says, I'm not talking to you. I'm not wasting my time with you. He's hanging there in a tree. If we don't go get him, his men are going to come find him and he's going to get away. And so Joab takes action. He goes takes his spears, evidently he has 3 spears with him, javelins, darts, whatever it is, puts it into his heart, and then his men surround and they deliver the final blows to take Absalom's life. Do it quick. Yeah, and they did. They did do that, right? They made it quick. Right. Yeah. If you look, go ahead. Well, and the one that it was too, Joab, is the one who brought him back to Jerusalem when he was hiding for 3 years. So he brought him back. And then he's also the one that when Absalom was still loyal to David and he wanted to see David, he sent for Joab, and Joab wouldn't respond to him. He didn't come to him. And so Absalom did what? You may remember? He burned his field up. And so, Joab probably still has that in the back of his mind, that Absalom burned his field up. And then on top of that, Absalom is trying to take over Israel. He's trying to go against God. And so David's men are loyal to David, but they're also loyal to God, and they're loyal to Israel. And so that's kind of how Joab is thinking when he's doing this. All right, verse 16. Then Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing Israel, for Joab restrained the people. So this is a verse that I kind of just read over when I read the lesson, didn't think anything about it. And when I went back to it, I thought, man, that's an important verse, because it says Joab restrained the people. And so the armies had this sense of loyalty where they were going to kill anybody that was going against David, going against God. And so even though Joab was the one that delivered the blow against Absalom, he made sure that as soon as Absalom was dead, he blew the trumpet. He wanted no more Israelites to die in this battle, on this battlefield. He wanted to make sure that everybody that was still there would stay alive, and because he knew that they would come back and serve David as king. There wasn't anybody else that was going after at the time. And so he didn't want any more bloodshed, even though the Israelites had gone against David and had gone against God. All right, the end of the scriptures today that we're in is verses 17 and 18. They took Absalom and cast him into a deep pit in the forest, and erected over him a great heap of stones, and all Israel fled, each to his tent. Now Absalom in his life had taken and set up for himself a pillar, which is in the king's valley, for he said, I have no son to preserve my name. So he named the pillar after his own name, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day. So we see kind of come to a close where they put him in a pit, they throw some rocks on him, and there's kind of some symbolic tie to this monument that he'd made to himself before his death, because he had no son. So he wanted to preserve his name. But so the lesson today, the biggest thing that I kind of see out of all of this is if we look at David and the love that David had for his sons, it just points out where his heart was. Even though he had sinned big time against God, his heart was in the right place. He had repented, he had come back to God, and he had a son that he loved so much that even though his son was trying to go after him and kill him, he still did not want his son to die because of those actions. So he had the heart that God wanted him to have. And I think for me, I just kind of look at the world we're in today. We look and there are bad things happening all around us. It's easy to focus on the bad things and say, well, I've done this in my life, so there's nothing good that I can do for God. But if we look at David, David is a great example of asking for forgiveness, repentance, and turning your heart back to God, because God continued to bless David even after his big sin that he committed. He continued to stay faithful to God, and God continued to stay faithful to him. Any other comments before we close today? John, would you lead us in a word of prayer, please?